Kahit saan kami mapabiyahe ni Pai, walang hihigit pa sa sariling atin. Lalo na sa mga dagat natin. Halos 80% ng Pilipinas ay napapaligiran ng dagat. Kasama na doon yung West Philippine Sea. 3.5 milyong kilometro na siksik sa natural resources. Source ng pagkain? Check. Source ng hanap buhay? Check. Source sa isa sa pinakabasaganang lugar sa Pilipinas? Talagang check na check. Kaya may mga bansang inanakaw to sa atin. Mga banyagang inaapi ang ating mga mangingisda. Yung para bang wala na tayong karapatan sa sarili nating likas na yaman. Yan ang hindi check. Kailangan natin ipaglaban ang sa atin. At kailangan natin ng leader na handang pumalag dahil ang atin ay atin. Yung mismo ang sinabi ni VP Leni Robredo tungkol sa West Philippine Sea. Kaya ilan sa ating magagaling na dating miyembro ng Armed Forces ang nagsasabi at naniniwala na si VP Leni Robredo lamang na may kakayahan, talino at tapang para maging presidente at commander-in-chief natin. Ipaglalaban niya ang Pilipinas para sa Pilipino. Kay Leni Robredo, sigurado tayo ang atin ay atin.
Nagawa niyang mamuno sa tama, nanindigan para kaywan at kaywan, laman ang isiping naglaban. Hangad niyang tayo ay mamuhay sa bansang ang lahat ay pantay. May karapatan tungo sa kaunlaran, handang maglingkod kailanman. Robredo, nagawa niyang lahat. May lakas, may galing at may pusong tapat. Leni Robredo, ating pinuno. Nagawa niyang lahat. Nagawa niyang ikaw ay turuan, buong pusong pinagsilbihan. Inangat ang lipunan, tinaas sa ating bayan. Di tayo pinabayaan. Leni Robredo, nagawa niyang lahat. May lakas, may galing at may pusong tapat.
Sa ngalan ng Ama, ng Anak at ng Espiritu Santo. Amen. Manalangin po tayo.
Walang sino man ang nabubuhay para sa sarili lamang. Walang sino man ang namamatay para sa sarili lamang. Tayong lahat ay may pananagutan sa isa't isa. Tayong lahat ay tinipon ng Diyos na kapiling niya. Sa ating pagmamahalan at paglilingkod sa kanino man, tayo ay nagdadala ng balita ng kaligtasan. Tayong lahat ay may pananagutan ng Diyos na kapiling yan. Sabay-sabay ng mag-aawitan ng mga bansa. Tayo'y sinuri ng Panginoon bilang mga bayan. Ay ngayong mahal, ay ngayong ulas na isa-isa. Ay ngayong mahal, ay nilibon ng Diyos na mahal ko sa inyo. Sabay-sabay ng mag-aawitan ng mga bansa. Tayo'y sinusay ng Panginoon bilang mga bayan. Ay ngayong mahal, ay mag-aawitan sa isa-isa. Ay ngayong mahal, ay kapatid ko na mahal sa Kanya. Tayong lahat ay pag-ibig sa isa-isa pa ko. Tayong lahat ay kapatid ko at ikaw pananagutan ko.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Bayang mag-iyo, perlas ng silanganan, halap ng puso, sa titig mo'y buhay. Upang hiniling, tuyang ka ng mag-ibig, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin, sa dagat at bundok, sa simulan, sa langit kong bughaw, may dilagang tumatawid sa pantayang minamahal. Pag-islap ng wataw at mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim. Araw naman, hatid pagsinta, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Ang kaganapan ay mag-aapi, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Welcome po sa ating Tapatan Media Forum at binabati namin ang lahat ng nakasubaybay sa atin sa Facebook at sa ating YouTube live stream. Kung nagtataka po kayo kung bakit Miyerkules ngayon, meron tayong tapatan imbis na Webes, nais po namin ipaabot sa inyong lahat na dalawa ang ating talakayan ngayong linggo. Meron pa rin po tayo bukas kung saan ang paksa ay kung ano ang mga reformang dapat ipatupad para sa ating mga kababayan sa Armed Forces of the Philippines o ang ating hukbong sandatahan. Kaya tayo may tapatan today ay dahil may mainit na issue na nakakaapekto sa ating mga kababayan. At ito ay ang issue ng digmaan sa pagitan ng Russia at Ukraine. Kasama din sa tatalakayan natin ngayon ang ating policy ng bansa sa West Philippine Sea. Tungkol sa nangyayari sa Russia at Ukraine, lubha po tayong apektado dito sa bansa. Tumataas ang presyo ng gasolina at crudo habang tumatagal ang digmaang ito. Halos 80 pesos o 80 pesos po ang per litro ng gasolina, samantalang aabot na sa 70 pesos ang per litro ng diesel. Nakakalulang presyo at masakit sa bulsa sa ating mga kababayan. Kaya damang-dama ng karaniwang tao ang epekto ng mataas na presyo ng produktong petrolyo. may multiplier effect po kasi ito. Tataas rin ang presyo ng pagkain tulad ng karne at gulay kasama na ang ibang mga bilihin at serbisyo. So, ang pag-uusapan natin ngayon ay kung ano ba ang posisyon na dapat kunin ng ating bansa sa dalawang nag-uumpugang mga bansang ito. Dapat ba na neutral tayo o kumampi sa isa? O may iba pa tayong pwedeng gawin? Malalaman po natin yan mamaya. Konektado din dito ang ating polisiya sa West Philippine Sea, particularly ang pag-angkin ng China sa ating teritoryo. Pag-uusapan din po natin yan mamaya. Dumako na po tayo sa ating mga panauhin. Mga kababayan, powerhouse ng foreign policy experts ang ating mga panelists at speakers ngayon, na binubuo ni na Professor Renato De Castro, isang profesor ng International Studies sa De La Salle University, at si Professor Richard Haydarian, isa ring professor, newspaper columnist at policy advisor. Kasama din po natin ngayon bilang panelist si Isambayan Convener Justice Tony Carpio. Huwag na po natin patagalin at ating simulan ang ating talakayan. Professor De Castro, kayo na po ang mauna. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and honor to be given an opportunity to talk about this very important issue. Now, if I could share my PowerPoint presentation. So, the idea for this webinar on the relationship between the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, and of course, the West Philippine Sea was brought about by my conversation with Justice Carpio in the light of a prevailing misinformation campaign that has two trends. Number one, what Russia is doing to Ukraine is justified. Russia is justified to do anything because it prevents NATO from expanding, and more significantly, what's happening in Ukraine is far away, so it's none of our business. So I'll start my presentation by quoting Neville Chamberlain when he was giving away an ally, Czechoslovakia, during the Munich appeasement. Quarrel in a faraway country between people whom we know nothing. So it's none of our business. Oh no, we know what happened to Chamberlain. Eventually, of course, Great Britain will, and of course, he'll be out of power by 1940, and in his place, you'll have Winston Churchill, of course, who would have the leadership to Germany's aggression. Okay, let's me just mention about the war. So, of course, in Russia, they don't want to mention it as a war, and it used to be a special military operation, simply parroting the Russian position. What's happening in Ukraine? Of course, prior to the outbreak of the war, Russia has already modernized its capabilities. It was preparing to wage a war, since, of course, Russia was able to annex Crimea in 2014. War happened on February 25, 2022, when Russia, of course, launched a full-scale military offensive. This is, of course, the first major armed conflict that happened in Europe since the Second World War. This is also a case of the largest country in the world attacking the second largest country in Europe. So this is not a minor incident. This is a major catastrophic event. Of course, the immediate goal of Russia is to absorb Ukraine, because from the perspective of Putin and, of course, many of the Russian people, we have similar culture, language, the Ukrainian. It has no right to become independent. The other reason, of course, is directed against the United States and NATO expansion to prevent it. So I'll just breeze through this. Of course, the initial plan of Putin was just a coercive diplomacy to intimidate the Ukrainians, to force the leadership to evacuate Kiev, and of course, then eventually Russian forces would occupy. It will be a coup d'etat on the part of Russia. Of course, this was prevented by the fact that the Ukrainian people, and this is something that we should also learn from Ukraine, we have to fight for what we believe for. If we believe that the West Philippine Sea belongs to the Philippines, then we should also fight for the West Philippine Sea. And of course, another important element behind this resistance of the Ukrainian is the importance of leadership. And this is something that we should also emphasize, The people would only fight if the leadership have, of course, the will and determination to protect the nation and, of course, to fight what it believes, what he or she believes is worth fighting for. And, of course, this is precisely what happened in Ukraine. I'll just breeze through this. So the plan of President Putin and Russia to finish the military operation, to drive away what he called the neo-Nazi and the drug addicts, simply failed because the Ukrainian nation said, we would like to maintain our independence. We have values that could not be compromised. So it's worth fighting for. The territory and, of course, the very survival of Ukraine is worth fighting for. The same way as if we have to educate the Filipino people, the West Philippine Sea is worth fighting for. So Ukrainian army systems, of course, defied decision makers and pundits. I myself predicted that this will be over in 1 or 2 days. This did not happen, simply because the Ukrainian people, led by an able and nationalist leadership, decided to resist. So, of course, Putin was put in this situation. You know, it's easy to start a war, but it's simply difficult how to end it. So we were talking about the implications, possible implications. I see this will be a long-term problem for the Philippines. High oil prices, uncertainty, so forth and so on. So again, I would like to emphasize the importance of political leadership. We should have the political leadership, of course, who has the foresight, and of course, you had the moral courage to lead the country, especially in this period of crisis. So I'll focus more on the imperative on Philippine foreign policy. Of course, we have the interest, the OFWs. But we mind you, of course, the lives of these 380 overseas Filipino workers in Ukraine, and their livelihood, and of course, their very existence was threatened by the Russian attack. And of course, there's always a question of neutrality. And we heard it from key government officials in this administration and a number of their analysts or pundits who are, of course, very much sympathetic to Russian position, and of course, possibly also very much respected to Russia's partner in this horrible endeavor. And of course, talking about our neighbor across the West Philippine Sea, and that is China. So can we basically be neutral regarding this? I will take the Swiss position. You know, Switzerland has this tradition of neutrality, but recently, of course, the Swiss have decided that they have to modify the strict and absolute notion of neutrality. Yes, we are neutral, but it does not prevent us to make a moral stand. Unfortunately, this government simply did not take into account the importance of the moral stand, which is actually defined in our Constitution. Our Constitution obliges the government to take a moral stand, and the moral stand is there. Article 2, Section 2 of the Philippine Constitution. Of course, this administration had always emphasized independent foreign policy, which I believe is Section 1. I don't know. Justice Carpio would correct me later. But he has simply forgotten Section 2. The Philippines renounces war as an instrument of national policy, adopt the generally accepted principle of international law, as of course part of the law of the land, of policy of peace, equality. You know, in this case, you cannot be neutral because it is obvious that Russia has used war as an instrument of national policy, which we will discuss later, which I have discussed earlier. Of course, the basis there I would not have to discuss was the Briand-Kellogg Pact of 1928, just less than a decade after the end of the First World War, that we solemnly declare names of the respected, that they condemn recourse to war for solution. I will not breeze into this. Then we go to the Articles of Principles of the United Nations, Article 2. We're a member of the United Nations. Again, this obliges the Philippines to take a moral stand. No, all members shall settle international dispute peacefully. I won't have to go into detail. And of course, you have Article 2, Paragraph 4, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat of use of force. So these are basically the legal moral justification. And of course, another moral issue that, you know, this war has basically raised in front of the Filipino nation, the issue of humanitarian disaster. We have about 1.5 million Ukrainians who are forced to leave their country. Will we just sit here and watch them suffer in refugee camps? The international community has been very generous to the Philippines every time we have a natural disaster. We have this man-made disaster happening in Ukraine, yet this government is simply concerned. It's a legitimate concern. I'm not saying it's not. But, overseas Filipino workers, 380 of them, what about the millions of Ukrainians who are suffering in refugee camps because of Russia's brutal and unprovoked war against their state and, of course, their nation? And, of course, this is, again, the moral dimension of the issue. Going back to the time of the Greeks, during the time of the Peloponnesian War, the strong do what they can must, and the weak suffer what they must. This is a case of Ukraine, and this is also a reality we face in the West Philippine Sea. That great powers could do what they want, conquer a territory, implement a policy of maritime expansion at the expense of the weaker and smaller powers. Ukraine was, of course, suffering from this. Are we here and just to see how Russia will do it would want to do with the Ukrainians suffering the fate? What if it reverse happened? What if a great power here would expand to our maritime domain and see the Filipinos accept the fate as it must? Then the international community will just watch and say, we can't do anything about it. So this is a moral dimension here. I'll just breeze through this. Of course, the larger picture here is the impact in terms of the context of Philippine foreign policy. So definitely what happened in Ukraine would have international ramification. And sooner or later, of course, what would happen here would be, you would have, of course, I'm old enough to remember. I was a young man when the Cold War ended. I'm now a senior citizen when I'm seeing again a new Cold War coming into motion. But this is a totally different Cold War. It will be a classic Cold War without ideological competition. It's just classic geopolitical, territory, and who would be the power on the top. So, a lot of things had happened in a matter of 2 weeks. Suddenly, Germany, that had refused rearmament and militarization, had basically accepted the fact that it had to rearm. And of course, you will have, this will be a challenge for our economic planners, for our OFWs. We will see a global economic decoupling and, of course, trade diversion. As, of course, Russia would become slowly be part of China's growing economic clout. Now, not only here in Asia, but also in Eurasia. Then you will have a fragmentation. I'll just breeze through this fragmentation in terms of the globalization, increase in defense budget. I will not discuss this. And of course, this will be our concern. As the West and the United States become focused on Europe, we have, of course, another great power here with expansionary tendency towards our maritime domain, and that is, of course, China. But I think the focus of China will be Taiwan. But Taiwan is not very far from the Philippines. Plus, of course, we have 150,000 OFWs in Taiwan. What would happen if you would have a crisis in Taiwan? And of course, this will happen, and this, again, will be confronted. Historically, of course, Southeast Asia will be, again, be an arena for the competition of great powers. And just, talking about Russia, let's look at what Lenin would say. What is to be done? Just my key recommendations. Number one, we have to condemn Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine as a clear violation of the UN Charter and direct cause of the most severe humanitarian crisis of the 21st century. Open the Philippines not only to Ukrainian, but also to Russian refugees. You also have a lot of Russians who are leaving the country because they don't want what President Putin has been doing. So let's provide an opportunity to go to the Philippines. We have this tradition that, of course, started during the time of the Commonwealth, under the time of President Manuel L. Quezon, when we welcomed thousands of Jews from Europe. So let's continue this tradition. Then extend immediate humanitarian assistance to Ukrainian refugees through the European Union and the EU member states. This is probably an opportunity for us to repair the damaged relationship this administration had done with our relationship with the European Union and other EU member states. So let's engage them in a humanitarian venture, given the light of how our president, beloved president, had called the European Union in the past. We have to save our national honor. by getting involved in this. And this is something very crucial. And this is where, of course, leadership, the future leadership after this election would have to take into account for the new government to accept the reality that Russia's war against Ukraine will not stay in Ukraine and in Europe, but will spread elsewhere. And the new leadership, which must have the vision, which must have the moral courage and conviction, must prepare the Philippine nation for this coming strategic contagion. What happened in Ukraine is just the beginning. I will end my presentation by a poem I usually ask my students in international relations would have to read at the start of the course. Don't ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. I end my presentation here. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to express my view regarding this matter.
Thank you very much, Professor De Castro. Ayan po mga kababayan, no? Hindi lang ito ay digmaan ng dalawang bansa. Apektado po tayo dito, tumataas ang mga petrolyo, mawawalan ng trabaho ang ating mga OFWs, at tumataas din ang presyo ng mga bilihin. Ang susunod po magpe-present, si Professor Heydarian, ay magbibigay sa atin ng posisyon ng ating bansa sa digmaang Ukraine at Russia. Professor Heydarian, the floor is now yours.
Yes, maraming salamat. Let me just try to keep this as short as possible so that we have more time for discussion. So I have 5 quick interventions here. I mean, before I begin, let me just say that, I think what we have been facing in the Philippines is a very deplorable case of toxic neutrality. That's how I want to describe it. It's kind of like toxic masculinity, right? You have a situation whereby partisans of certain powers, or more than partisans for that matter, have been invoking war or fear of war with major powers in order to coax and cajole us into cowardice in face of aggression and clear violation of sovereignty of an independent nation, in that case, Ukraine. And I think this is something very deplorable. And unfortunately, I would say it's quite unique to the Philippines among US allies or democracies in this part of the world. What's interesting is that neutral countries, technically legally neutral countries like Switzerland and Singapore, have been leading sanctions against Russia for its latest aggression. In fact, according to Axios, Switzerland leads all other nations in the number of sanctions it has imposed, include up to 568 sanctions were imposed by neutral Switzerland. So just food for thought for people who talk about neutrality as an excuse for inaction and moral vacuity. Let's talk about the issue per se. I mean, first of all, before talking about Ukraine, let's not forget that as tragic as the situation in Ukraine is, we are facing very tragic situation in places like Yemen, which actually is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, not to mention in Afghanistan following the very sloppy withdrawal of the Biden administration from that place. So let's not forget this crisis. Let's not just care about what's happening in Europe. But going back to Europe, I mean, I've been covering this issue as close as I could since attending the Munich Security Conference last year in Germany. And since then, I've visited Paris and Berlin and talked to officials and experts to try to understand how Europe is approaching this issue. To be frank, based on my own discussions on the sidelines, it looks like many Europeans themselves were shocked and were not expecting this. But once it happened, we saw that the West closed the ranks. And in fact, Germany really oversaw a massive transformation in its foreign policy. German Chancellor Scholz, who was just being made fun of a few weeks earlier as the silent chancellor, came out with a historic speech promising to make Germany a major force, including increasing their defense spending to more than 2% of their GDP, which means that Germany alone could have a defense spending as big as that of Russia or even bigger in the near future. So we're not only talking about US here, but major European powers who are now closing the ranks. And Germany, which is very dependent on Russian energy imports, decided to suspend indefinitely the Nord Stream 2 project with Russia. So European countries are sacrificing their own energy security despite very high prices of energy in Europe over the past 3 months in order to stand in solidarity with Ukraine and also to negate a clear aggression against the post-Cold War order in Europe. Number 3, I noticed based on conversations, including with our friends and partners in Paris and with the French Foreign Ministry late last month, that the crisis in Ukraine is not going to distract Europe and the transatlantic alliance from China. Just because Russia is creating trouble, it doesn't mean makalimutan nila in China. If anything, it has had the opposite effect because many people know that Russia is fundamentally a declining power. Over the long run, Russia is not the kind of superpower who can really challenge American supremacy. It's really China, and almost everyone knows that. In fact, I asked the German Foreign Minister Burbeck during the Munich Security Conference about China, and now Germany, even Germany, which really relies on exports to China, has officially designated China as a systemic rival. So the French, the Germans, a lot of them have concerns about China's behavior in this part of the world. In America, there's a lot of worry about what's happening in Taiwan. We saw two major delegations, including former Secretary of State Pompeo, visiting Taiwan recently to show bipartisan support to Taiwan. So the situation in Europe has actually made the West more alert to long-term threats, not necessarily distracting them from the long-term threats that could be posed by China. Number four, what happens in Ukraine, as the Japanese foreign minister put it last month in the Munich Security Conference, is a universal issue. This is an issue that has implication for all of us, but it has specific implication for us in the Philippines and in the West Philippines because, if you look at it, Putin is using the historical language in ways that China has been using the historical language in the South China Sea. Just as Carpio knows very well about this, Putin has concocted all these ideas that Ukraine is a fake country, it doesn't exist, etc. Therefore, its aggression is justifiable, supposedly. Guess what? The Chinese have been saying similar things about South China Sea, essentially saying none of us had really a civilization back in the day. They're the only real civilization. They sent some folks down the island, down these islands. Therefore, all of this belongs to them. And that is why, even though they lost the UNCLOS case, they're saying that their historical argument stands. This is a very dangerous situation whereby major powers are concocting fake narratives in order to justify aggression against smaller neighbors or in their own spheres of influence. So the parallel is very clear. Number two, Russia is not doing very well in Ukraine. Let's just be very honest about it. It's the second week the Russians do not have supremacy in the air. The Ukrainians are fighting back hard on the ground. Very sloppy mobilization by the Russians. We see Soviet-era kind of inefficiencies. Why is this important? Especially for us, because China's military and doctrine is very similar to Russia, right? Both of them, China is a communist regime. Russia is a former communist regime. Their militaries are very similar. So China may have a large military, just like Russia, but we are saying that having a large military alone doesn't mean that you can have sophisticated multi-domain operations. So I think the vulnerabilities that Russia is showing has something to say about what China could be. So if there's a paper tiger, perhaps some would say there's a paper bear, but I won't underestimate Russia. I'm just saying let's not overestimate Russia, and by extension, let's not overestimate China. But the last point I want to emphasize under this is that we're seeing clear US bipartisan support. So mahalaga ito because we have been seeing in the initial phases, troll armies, right? Partisans of certain personalities in these countries have been saying, see, they have abandoned Ukraine. That's what they're going to do to the Philippines. My goodness, let's just forget about the US. They're unreliable. Guess what? Since 2014, US has given more than $3 billion in military assistance to Ukraine, which is not even a treaty ally. And now $10 billion in assistance is in the pipeline. Now, the Philippines is a treaty ally. So imagine what would have happened if a treaty ally was under invasion. That is why this is important. If a non-treaty ally like Ukraine is getting all this support and help from the US and all, imagine what help countries like the Philippines could get. That's why this is a very important situation. That's why this is becoming embarrassing for partisans of those who are saying US is unreliable, therefore let's get rid of our alliance. And lastly, I don't have much evidence on this, but we see a lot of report coming out that it seems we have very disturbing phenomenon of disinformation networks who are forwarding the narratives pro, which sides. And my fear is that this says a lot about what could happen if certain candidates win come these elections. Not to mention, we already saw many troubling signs under the current administration and under the current president. So I think we have to watch out for many, many things. And what's happening in Ukraine is having direct, indirect, and moral and ethical impact for the Philippines, not to mention the economic impact that it's having on a lot of us in the region. So I'll just keep it there and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Heidaria. Now to highlight the parallelism between Russia and China in the West Philippine Sea issue, we now call on Justice Tony Carpio.
Thank you, JP. Good morning to everyone. We are answering in this forum two questions. One is a general question, the other one is a specific question. Of course, in general, what is the best foreign policy for Philippine national interest? Well, the answer is simple. The best foreign policy for Philippine national interest is a foreign policy that will protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Philippines and preserve world peace. But let's go to the specific in relation to this war in Ukraine. As a nuclear armed state with a weak military facing encroachment of its island territories and maritime zones in the West Philippine Sea by a nuclear armed and militarily powerful China, what is the best foreign policy for Philippine national interest in view of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? The best foreign policy for the Philippines in this specific case is one that will ensure the following. First, China will not use the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a precedent to encroach on Philippine island territories and maritime zones in the West Philippine Sea. Second, the UN Charter, which prohibits and outlaws the use of force or threat of force to settle disputes between states, will not be overturned because this fundamental principle in the UN Charter is what prevents wars by protecting weaker states and restraining stronger states, and thereby preserving world peace. Article 2, paragraph 3 of the 1945 UN Charter provides, and I quote, "All member states shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered," end of quote. Then Article 2, paragraph 4 of the same UN Charter provides, and I quote, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the UN, of the United Nations," end of quote. And lastly, Article 33 of the UN Charter provides that all states must settle all their disputes only by peaceful means, through negotiation, mediation, or arbitration. Now, these are the bedrock principles upon which the United Nations was founded. These are the bedrock principles that have prevented the recurrence of world wars. Prior to the 1945 UN Charter, war was a legitimate means of settling disputes between states, and also a legitimate means of acquiring or annexing the territory of another state. Prior to the 1945 UN Charter, might was right. Under the 1945 UN Charter, war was outlawed as a means of settling disputes between states or acquiring territory of another state. Under the UN Charter, right is might. Now, the United Nations General Assembly, which is the locus of world opinion, overwhelmingly voted to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine because the invasion clearly violated the bedrock principles upon which the United Nations was founded. The peoples of the world represented in the UN General Assembly understand perfectly that the Russian invasion, if not strongly condemned, will bring back the world to the might is right era. Might is right era before the 1945 UN Charter. Before the 1945 UN Charter, small or militarily weak states were often invaded by their militarily stronger states. There was no international law to protect weaker states from aggression by stronger states before the 1945 UN Charter. The era before the 1945 UN Charter spawned in succession 2 world wars in less than 30 years, causing untold destruction because of powerful weapons of mass destruction developed in the 20th century. Today, the world nuclear powers are in possession of even far more destructive weapons that could end human existence on our planet as we know it. When a nuclear-armed China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012, we did not send our Marines to retake Scarborough Shoal because our Navy was no match to the Chinese Navy. Instead, we sent our lawyers to The Hague invoking arbitration under Article 33 of the UN Charter and under the compulsory arbitration provisions of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to invalidate China's 9-dash line, which was China's basis in seizing Scarborough Shoal. We won an overwhelming victory in the arbitral award of July 12, 2016, which affirmed our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea. Today, the US, UK, the entire European Union, Australia, Japan, Canada, India, and other countries recognize the arbitral award, preventing China from legalizing by military force its claim to the West Philippine Sea. It is international law, UNCLOS, and the UN Charter that have protected our exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea from Chinese encroachment. Ukraine was in possession of almost a third of the stockpile of nuclear bombs of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics upon its dissolution in 1992. Russia signed the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, along with the United States and the United Kingdom, expressly guaranteeing the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine giving up this huge stockpile of nuclear weapons. So Russia convinced Ukraine to give up its stockpile of nuclear weapons. In exchange, Russia guaranteed the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Ironically, Russia under President Putin was the first state to violate the Budapest Memorandum by first annexing Crimea in 2014 and now by invading the rest of the territory of Ukraine and even denying Ukraine's right to exist as a nation and as a sovereign state. This, of course, is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. The reason for China's invasion of Ukraine is Vladimir Putin's dream of reviving the old Russian Empire, which included Ukraine as part of its territory. This will prevent Ukraine, a nation of 44 million people, from charting its own future as a sovereign state. And the large majority of Ukrainians want their country to be a member of the European Union and also of NATO. As a member of NATO, Ukraine will be protected from Russian invasion under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which recognizes an attack on a member as an attack on all member states. The three Baltic states that were annexed by Russia in 1940, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, fortunately were able to join NATO before Russia became imperialist again under Putin. Ukraine has not been as fortunate. This brings me to my last point. The only known antidote that the weak state can use against invasion or annexation by a powerful neighboring state is a mutual defense security with other states to provide a balance of power. The Philippines has a mutual defense treaty with the US, a treaty that provides a balance of power in the West Philippine Sea for the Philippines in relation to China. The US has reiterated time and again that any attack on a Philippine public vessel in the South China Sea, which includes the West Philippine Sea, will trigger the operation of the Mutual Defense Treaty. Russia's invasion of Ukraine may embolden China to become even more aggressive in the West Philippine Sea. So the Philippines must learn to leverage the Mutual Defense Treaty with the US in defending the Philippines' exclusive economic zone and island territories in the West Philippine Sea against China. We cannot afford that our next president will follow President Duterte, who infamously announced after he assumed office, President Duterte said, the Philippine Navy will patrol only up to our 12 nautical mile territorial sea and avoid patrolling our exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea so as not to displease China. This is despite the clear mandate of the Constitution that the state shall protect its marine wealth in its exclusive economic zone. President Duterte has even gratuitously ceded to China the West Philippine Sea when he stated in his 2019 State of the Nation address that China is already in possession of the West Philippine Sea, which is factually and grossly false. Worse, President Duterte admitted in his 2020 State of the Nation address that he is inutile when it comes to defending the West Philippine Sea. This is an express admission to the entire nation that he will not defend the West Philippine Sea in clear violation of his constitutional duty as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The Constitution expressly mandates that the armed forces, and I quote, shall secure the sovereignty of the state and the integrity of the national territory, end of quote. So in the May 2022 elections, we must elect a president who will perform the primordial constitutional duty of the president as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces to defend Philippine territory and maritime zones in the West Philippine Sea and elsewhere. Thank you, and a pleasant morning to everyone.
Thank you so much, Justice Carpio, for that presentation. Kung may mga tanong po tayo, pwede na po tayong dumako sa ating open forum. Pero bago po ang lahat, ipapaliwanag lang po ulit namin ang ating mga house rules para po sa mga katanungan. Dalawang paraan po, raise hand at hintayin pong tawagin ang inyong pangalan or isulat po ang inyong katanungan sa chat box ng Zoom. Para po sa mga nakasubaybay sa atin sa Facebook Live at YouTube, gamitin po ang comment section para sa inyong mga tanong at sisikapin nating maibato ang mga tanong ninyo sa ating mga speakers ngayong araw. Okay? Ang una pong magtatanong ay mula po dito sa mga members ng media kung meron man. Kung wala po ay magtatanong po muna tayo from a Facebook user. Okay? A question po from a Facebook user to Professor De Castro. Ano raw po, Professor De Castro, ang epekto ng digmaang Ukraine at Russia sa presyo ng petrolyo? Thank you.
Well, ang direct impact niyan kasi yung supply because Russia is the second largest exporter of oil. And because of the Western sanctions, actually wala pang sanctions sa Russian oil. Ang sanction lang dun sa mga banks that are supposed to be processing those transactions. So the United States and Europe until recently are still getting their oil from Russia. But now I think recently President Biden already indicated they will stop the importation of oil from Russia. So what's basically happening in the market is largely still speculative. So that's the reason why tumaas yung presyo ng oil. So again, this is an element of geopolitics. So ang gagawin ngayon ng US, the US is now tapping Iran and Venezuela to provide the oil that the world might lose because of the economic sanctions on Russia. But of course, we are suffering the implication. And I bet this will be a long-term implication because the supply will have to adjust to the amount of oil that Russia will be prevented from selling to the world market because of its aggression against Ukraine. And honestly, I don't think the conflict will end very soon. I hope it will end very soon. But given the fact that the first blood has already been spilled, the Russian forces have already killed several Ukrainians and vice versa. And of course, the pride of a great power is at stake. Then I think the war would drag on. This is where, again, leadership would have to enter. So the long-term goal, of course, will be to lessen our dependence on fossil fuel by developing renewable energy. Isa pang point dyan then, of course, is to find alternative source. And makikita natin yan sa West Philippine Sea. If we could explore and of course tap the resource, especially at Recto Bank. I hope I answered his or her question.
Thank you, Professor De Castro. I think Professor Haydarian also raised his hands. Maybe you
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because just a few days ago, the oil markets were kind of tapering off because there was an expectation that Iran will come back on stream because the Iranian nuclear negotiations were about to end. Except suddenly Russia was trying to play a spoiler and said, hey, no, let's not finalize the deal unless you remove sanctions on me trading with Iran. So now we have some tensions going on there because Iran could actually significantly help the global markets as previously the second biggest exporter of oil. And at the same time in Europe, right, because of this crisis, they're being now incentivized to further diversify their energy base. So this crisis with Russia actually is also bad for them in the long term because it's incentivizing many countries to move towards renewables and all. So Russia may have some leverage now, but I'm not sure that leverage will last over the long run. Not to mention, lastly, the US is the biggest exporter of oil by some measures. And now the US will be in a very good position to fill in the gap also itself, right? So these are the factors that I think a lot of people forget when they only talk about Russian leverage.
Thank you, Professor Haydarian. Miss Jen Galvez of Vanguard Radio would also like to ask a question. Jen?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, sirs. If you don't mind, I have 3 questions because we're following closely this issue on Russia's invasion. My first question is with Professor Castro. Sir, kasi diba there's a ban on, there's a push, growing push to ban the use of airspace by NATO. Kaso Russia is very much opposing with regard to that. Do you think, sir, it will finally come to a decision where NATO would eventually agree? And if so, to close the airspace? If so, will it trigger really I know we are at the ebb, obviously, of World War III, but do you think it will trigger a full blast World War III setup and activate the so should I call Axis alliance between among Russia, China, and basically anti-West countries?
I'll first address your question. There's no alliance yet. It's still a strategic alignment. There's no commitment from both sides to come to each other's assistance. But one thing is clear, China has been bankrolling the Russian economy since the Crimean annexation. Your question regarding NATO has already made a decision. It will not create what you call a no-fly zone because this will trigger really a third world war. Putin has already put the Russian nuclear forces on higher level of alert.
Yes, sir. Sorry, but yes, that is on the news.
Yes.
But what I'm asking is, will it come to a point where they will say, okay, let's
I don't
decide
think
on
so, unless of course it's unthinkable at this point in time for NATO because they knew what will be the consequences. What NATO is planning now, which is also very dangerous, is to provide Ukraine with MiG-29 from the Polish Air Force. Now, later Poland realized that, the Russians might decide to attack Polish airfields. So they transferred the planes into Germany. So actually, this is a very dangerous situation. I grew up during the Cold War. We have never seen this during the Cold War, where you have really direct military confrontation between the Soviet Union and, of course, at that time, Warsaw Pact and NATO. During the Cold War, there was a degree of stability. And people here seems to be so indifferent, so apathetic about this. I think this is because of a generation that simply doesn't have any recollection of the Cold War. The same as a generation have no recollection of the martial law period. Iba na talaga ang pumuti na ang buhok. I end here.
Thank you, sir.
JP, can I add to that?
Yes, please, Justice.
The Poland has transferred already the MiG-29s to German airfields and authorized the US to transfer these MiG-29s to Ukraine. So it's the next best thing to a no-fly zone, because a no-fly zone will mean Third World War, because that means NATO fighter jets will be fighting Russian fighter jets. So it's the two defense blocks fighting each other directly, and that's what we don't want to happen. So Poland has just given their fighter jets, their MiG-29s. The Ukrainian pilots are familiar with these planes. They gave it to the US, and the US will transfer the planes to Ukraine. That's the latest now. So your question whether NATO will agree to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, I don't think that will happen. If that happens, then we have a World War III. Thank you.
Can I add a little more, Justice?
Yes, go
Although
ahead.
technically speaking, the transfer of those MiG-29s could already be construed as an act of war.
Well, Putin already said that any military assistance to Ukraine by the NATO countries are like acts of war. But he said like acts of war, but he's not declaring it as an act of war. Because if it's an act of war, that means he is also he is saying there is a status of a war status between the NATO and USSR and Russia.
Okay.
So
Jen?
for my second question, I'd like to address this to Justice Carpio, and then my third would be for Professor Richard. Justice Carpio, you said that well, you presented a very a thorough report to the Filipino people on the West Philippine Sea, taking sides, China, etc. Assuming po, kasi ngayon our government doesn't have a very clear stand on this issue. Assuming, sir, we know more or less what will happen. In fact, it is what's happening right now. When we don't take a stand, people ba? Paano po if we take a stand, a very blatant stand, like what if there's a miracle that President Duterte would say, condemn the act of war, invasion of President Putin? What do you think will be the obvious and immediate effect on the Philippines?
Well, in the UN General Assembly, we voted to condemn the Russian invasion as a violation of international law, violation of the UN Charter. That is the official position of the Philippines before the United Nations. But surprisingly, President Duterte said, we are neutral. So maybe that can square, well, like what Professor Richard said, that like Switzerland is a neutral country, but it has sanctioned Russia, imposed sanctions on Russia. So maybe Duterte is saying we are neutral, but we follow the UN Charter, that this is a war of aggression that is outlawed by the UN Charter. Maybe that's his point. But to me, our official position is what we have put forward in the UN. We voted to condemn the Russian invasion. That is our official position. Thank you.
Thank you. For my last question to Professor Richard. Sir, I've been following your articles on many issues, and this in particular I'm very interested because you mentioned about fake news, disinformation, because disinformation is far more worse than fake news. Russia just recently passed the fake news law very recently. Do you think it will come to a point where the Philippines will eventually follow that, and while we don't have that law as of the moment, do you think, sir, that there will be windows of opportunities for us in the media, how to really collectively fight the disinformation campaign that is growing rampantly here in not just in that side of the world, but also here in the Philippines, considering that our election is upcoming?
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's a tougher question. I'd rather not discuss the no-fly zone issues and all. I mean, the thing is this, I've been following Putin for quite some time. I mean, my dad comes from the Caspian region. I mean, Russian literature and Russian history is something very close to my heart. But another reason is because Putin is the ultimate idol of all of these right-wing populist leaders emerging all across the world, from Orban in Hungary, all the way to Prabowo Subianto in Indonesia, who's now the defense minister and could become the next president. And President Duterte openly said that Putin is his favorite president. And Putin clearly has created a system that many call illiberal democracy. And now even the democracy part is questionable, but the illiberal part is very clear. I mean, Putin has shown that you don't have to do it the old style dictator. You don't have to go and put people in jail and shoot them down and all of that, although some crazy things have been happening recently. In fact, in 2001, the first sign that Putin is moving towards that new system came in when Russia's leading independent media, I think NDTV, was actually, I think what happened there is that they used tax evasion cases to go after them, right? So they didn't go after them in the usual dictatorial way, shut them down, put them in jail. No, they used kind of a subtle ways to go after them. 20 years later, aren't we seeing similar things happening in other countries, including, some would say, somewhere closer to home, right? This Putin playbook is essentially the 21st century playbook for populist authoritarianism. That is why we have to very carefully watch what is happening in Russia. And in fact, one of my favorite writers is Masha Gessen, right? Who's a former Russian journalist based in New York right now. And she wrote something about how to survive authoritarianism, right? She gave like 10 points, etc. I've been reading her because that helped me to cope with the situation we're facing more recently in our part of the world. So because what we're seeing here is authoritarian learning, right? The same way that other countries used to copy the US to try to be like US, now many authoritarian populist leaders are copying Russia. That is why the playbook that is being used there could be very much something that will be applied in other countries, especially if the Philippines crosses the barrier. I think the Philippines is already close to the cliff, right? Some would even debate whether the Philippines is a genuine democracy anymore. Yeah, I mean, having elections alone doesn't mean you're a democracy. I mean, for heaven's sake, Saddam even had elections. Elections doesn't say anything. It's really about rule of law. It's about checks and balances, right? And a lot of those institutional indicators are on the downward trajectory. But one thing that really worries me is also disinformation training, right? Major influencers and trolls popping up in different countries that are very known for liquid warfare. And then the next thing you know, they're saying things about geopolitics, even though these people had zero background in geopolitics. Suddenly now, my goodness, they're experts in Russian history and Russian geopolitics and questioning all of us as a bunch of pro-American fools, right? This is a really interesting, but a bit too obvious turn of events, right? So if you're a journalist, you're in the media, you're a democratic activist, you're looking at the situation in Ukraine, you're looking at the disinformation campaign, and you're looking at what Philippines could look like in the coming years if we continue some very, very disturbing trend lines. So yes, I watch very carefully what's happening in Russia because that could be a playbook in other parts of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, our next question po is from Greg Falcotelo to Justice Carpio. Justice Carpio, you mentioned in your presentation about the Budapest Memorandum, an agreement which Russia allegedly violated when it invaded Ukraine. And there is a principle in international law that says, pacta sunt servanda, agreements must be kept in good faith by the states. Question po, is there any liability or culpability on the part of Ukraine sa UN, and how will the UN enforce it? Sa Russia po. And how will the UN enforce it? Thank you.
Well, there are several interpretations of the Budapest Memorandum. The U.S. is saying that while it signed the memorandum, it's not a treaty that the U.S. is bound because it was not approved by the U.S. Senate and it's not a domestic law. So the U.S. is saying it's not legally binding on the U.S. The British are also waffling, but I think the problem here is there is no country, there's no world policeman that can enforce that Budapest Memorandum. You cannot enforce that against Russia, which has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. In other words, what you can do is use that to convince world opinion that Russia is wrong, that Russia is the aggressor. But you have to give it to the Ukrainian people because they have sued actually Russia before the ICJ for the invasion of Crimea in 2014. And also they are now suing Russia again because they have a treaty on the use of weapons that Russia is using weapons that have been banned. So they're very creative. Remember that the idea of a war, a crime against humanity, genocide, started in Ukraine. It was the Ukrainian lawyers who formulated that theory and it was adopted. So the Ukrainians are very bright people, especially creating all of these legal theories. And the the Budapest Memorandum, unfortunately, there is no world policeman to enforce that. But that should serve as a lesson to everybody. Because when Ukraine gave up its nuclear stockpile and accepted the guarantee of Russia, Russia said, we guarantee your sovereignty and territorial integrity. You cannot accept the guarantee of a neighbor that is stronger than you and has designs. And previously in their history, Ukraine was part of Russia. Ukraine was incorporated into Russian Empire. And so there is this historical memory of Russians that once before Ukraine was part of Russia and it should go back to Russia. And that is the mindset of Putin. So the Ukrainians should have been aware that there will always be imperialists in Russia. And unfortunately now the president of Russia is an imperialist. He wants to recover all the territories under the old Russian Empire. And that's why the Baltic states are also in danger. But the Baltic states, they're lucky because they joined NATO right on time. But the Ukrainians waffled. They wanted to be part of EU, but whether to be part of NATO, they had a problem because there was many of their politicians were Eastern Ukrainians and were looking at Russia. So they did not decide immediately, and the train left them already. So they're they have this problem now, and Putin knows that he will lose the chance to incorporate Ukraine into Russia if Ukraine becomes part of NATO. Because if it takes Ukraine when it's already part of NATO, it means the end of the world. It means world war. And Putin knows that Russia will also be destroyed. So Putin is making his move because this is last chance to stop Ukraine from slipping away from the sphere of influence of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Tony. Professor De Castro, Professor Hidarian, you might want to add something. Okay. All right. Ang susunod pong tanong is one of our members of the media who is present here with us. This is a question for Justice Tony on Isambayan's position on Pogo. And if Lenny, what is our position on Pogo, Justice Tony? And if Lenny wins, what steps will we take to rectify the Remulla's blunder by selling that piece of land to the Chinese, which could very well be a forward base of their espionage operations here in the Philippines?
Are you referring to Pogo, the gambling operations?
Yes, Justice Tony. Yeah.
Well, my position there is that's illegal because we are setting an operation here, a gambling operation in Manila, let's say in the reclamation area, and the clients are in China. The people who put bets are Chinese mainlanders, but gambling is illegal in China. And the Chinese have said, that's illegal. We don't want our Chinese citizens to be betting in Pogos in the Philippines. And they have banned. In fact, they have a campaign against their citizens putting bets on gambling operations abroad. So I think, well, first of all, it's not a friendly act because we are inviting Chinese to engage in gambling when the Chinese government is against it. Second, our own laws prohibit gambling unless it is done in a PAGCOR site. It must be run by PAGCOR or authorized by PAGCOR. And there is another condition that PAGCOR says. In its own internal rules, PAGCOR says, we will allow gambling operations in the Philippines with clients abroad if the country of those clients allow it. If it is legitimate in China, then we can allow it. But it's not legitimate in China. So we should close down all of those pogos because our own law prohibits gambling outside of areas authorized by PAGCOR, and PAGCOR itself says we will not allow pogos if their own countries do not allow gambling. So that's one. Now, as to the island, I'm not too familiar with that island. I don't know the facts, whether it's actually sold or leased, and what are the terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Tony. Our next question is from Marlene Espiritu, addressed to Professors Heydarian and De Castro. This is the question. Can the UN remove Russia's representation in the UN over a period of time as a punishment? And the next question is, Marcos is very friendly to China. What is the future of the country under his presidency if by any miracle he wins? Thank you.
Okay, can I address it? I think that
Okay.
will be very challenging because number one, the predecessor state of Russia, the Soviet Union, was a founding member of the United Nations. And of course, Russia is also a permanent member of the United Nations Security Assembly. So, Council, I'm sorry, United Nations Security Council, I'm sorry, terribly sorry, United Nations Security Council. So I don't think Russia could be removed from the United Nations, given the fact that it's, the predecessor state, the Soviet Union, was a founding member. And of course, Russia right now is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. But just to give you another historical anecdote, the Soviet Union was expelled, the only country that was expelled from the League of Nations when it invaded Finland in 1939. But I don't think this will happen in the 21st century. Regarding our, that was supposed to be the more popular candidate in terms of surveys, well, he already indicated that he is eyeing the China's blessing when he mentioned some of words like, China is powerful. There's no point in challenging China. We'll simply be overwhelmed. Let's rather settle the dispute with China through bilateral means. Then, of course, he has a very disparaging view regarding our relationship with the United States and the Mutual Defense Treaty. And this is my point, no? I've criticized President Duterte for adopting an appeasement foreign policy. But I believe, just in case he will become president, he will be worse because his policy will be defeatist. Appeasement could be a form of a tactical, like what happened to Neville Chamberlain. You're not powerful, so you try to offer concession. The worst, of course, will be defeatist because you already admit you cannot do anything. So I think he will be a worse president when it comes to the West Philippine Sea issue than, of course, President Duterte.
Thank you,
Can I
Professor
add
De
to that,
Castro.
JP?
Yes, please, Justice Tony.
Article 6 of the UN Charter says a member that has persistently violated the principles of the UN Charter can be expelled by the General Assembly upon recommendation of the UN Security Council. But in the UN Security Council, Russia has a veto. So it can never pass a resolution expelling Russia because Russia will just veto it. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the Ukrainian ambassador also mentioned the other week that we have a weird situation whereby Russia is the president right now, rotating president of the United Nations Security Council. So Russia is presiding over a council about its own aggression against the principle of UN. So that tells you about the ridiculous situation we're in. Not to mention, the UNSC was supposed to be much bigger in terms of the permanent members. In fact, India was invited based on some reports in the 1960s, but Nehru turned it down in some deference to China, and later on he was proven so wrong for the deference. So I think that we have to have also some serious discussion about the UNSC's composition of permanent members. I think Germany, I think India, I think Brazil, Japan, many other countries should be also there. And at the same time, let's not forget the Russian people. We have to engage the Russian people, right? A lot of Russians are not happy with the situation. A lot of Russians have been protesting this situation. A lot of Russians are going to suffer a lot. So I don't think kicking out Russia per se is going to help the situation, because at the end of the day, you have to have communication channels with the country that has the biggest landmass and biggest stockpile of nuclear weapons, among other things. So I think we have to look at the long term. Now, speaking about the next president, I am personally against defeatism. I share a lot of reservations of my colleagues, including Dr. De Castro and Justice Carpio, about certain candidates over the others. I think they're completely valid. At the same time, I'm also not fatalistic in the sense that I believe, and I've been writing about this, whoever becomes the next president, they're going to face structural limitations. The Philippine public is very much against China in terms of the bullying in the West Philippine Sea, much more favored in terms of our relations about US. The Philippine defense establishment is not personal army of our president, at least not yet, based on what we understand. So we have seen a lot of pushback against the excesses of President Duterte. So if you bother to watch the SMNI debate, which was quite a strange debate in the sense that I think we had 1.5 hours of debate on foreign policy, something that I think was not expected. If you look at it, Bongbong Marcos suddenly was sounding tough. In fact, at some points, Bongbong Marcos was tougher on West Philippine Sea than Calyodi, the Guzman, which was kind of a weird situation, to be honest. And why do you think Bongbong Marcos said things like, oh, we need to put our Navy there to protect our Coast Guard and all? Why do you think he would say that? It's precisely because of the structural limitation I mentioned. So while I have certain reservations with the defeatist language and predisposition, I'm not giving up on the Filipino people. I'm not giving up on the Philippine armed forces and patriots in the government. I believe they'll do the right thing no matter who becomes the next president. But nothing is automatic. That's why whoever becomes the next president, we have to continue to fight the good fight and fight for the West Philippine Sea and dignity of our nation.
Thank you, Professor Heydarian. I'll ask you another question from a Facebook user. Ano-ano ang mga bansang pwedeng kumampi sa Ukraine at Russia na pwedeng magsimula ng World War III at ano ang magiging papel ng Pilipinas dito?
Maybe Professor De Castro first. Yeah.
Well, supposedly China is a partner, not an ally. Because there's no mutual defense agreement. But funny thing, China did not veto the resolution filed by, I think, the United States in the United Nations Security Council. It just abstained. And China also did not vote no. I think there are only 5 countries that voted no to the UN resolution, UN General Assembly's resolution condemning Russia's action. I think North Korea voted, right? Eritrea. I don't know about Venezuela, but only 4. China did not even vote no, always use abstention. So this also raises a question regarding how cohesive is that security partnership is. Now, what other, there are only basically 2. But this is again, looking back at history, if you have a group of great powers who are dissatisfied with the system, just like what happened during the Second World War, this always creates the possibility for a major war among the great powers. Not necessarily it might go to nuclear, but there's always that possibility. Yeah. Okay, I hope I addressed that question. Richard might have an opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I completely agree with Dr. De Castro in this. I mean, just to put it this way, as I mentioned a while ago, yes, Russia is a major power, but if country like Germany alone, right, really invest in its military, and if they were allowed to have nuclear weapons and all, Germany can pretty much match Russia in many sense of the word, right? Then you have France, then you have Britain. So it's not a hopeless situation. I mean, this was the thing. If you saw the joint statement by Russia and China a few weeks ago declaring a new world order, it was extremely pretentious. It was as if only US, China, and Russia existed and the only superpowers are the ones that matter. But by the way, we have a lot of other animals in the zoo, right? We have all of these so-called middle powers or just below superpower threshold powers. I mean, here in Asia, for instance, yes, China is a major power. But, Japan is a force to reckon with. Indonesia and Vietnam are emerging as powers of their own ranks. India is a force to reckon with. So I think one of the problems we have is that we tend to reduce the world to a competition among superpowers, and then lahat tayo were the proverbial grass for the elephants. But I always say, yes, you have elephants, but you have also giraffes and lions and hippopotamus and all sorts of other players here. So one of the things that annoys me in a lot of geopolitical discussion is how it deprives the rest of the world from agency. It's as if umasa na lang tayo na mabait yung mga superpowers, or kung hindi, tapos na ang laban. That's why I don't like that Thucydides overused cliche quote that, the Greeks wrote a lot of things. I can cite a lot of other quotes from the Greeks that say the world is not just about major powers. In fact, if you look at the theory of middle powers, it goes back to the Greeks and the Chinese, who mention middle countries or middle forces that can actually mediate between the major forces. So I have faith in India, I have faith in Japan, I have faith in EU, I have faith in ASEAN to grow and to become more important players, to make sure we're not at the mercy of any superpower. Because to be honest, when Trump was the US president, the US was not also a very reassuring superpower for a lot of their allies in Europe and across the world. So I think this is one thing that we tend to forget in our discussion. The world is not just about those countries. There's so much more to this world, and there's so many other problems we have to deal with together sometimes, including with Russia.
Thank you, Professor Heydarian. We have another question from Bea Bernardo of PTV4. Any reaction from our guests regarding the statement of President Duterte that the Philippines must honor recto bank exploration deal with China? Maybe Justice Carpio is laughing, so maybe he'll be the one to answer this question. Okay.
Yeah, I was just asking Dindo Manhit, do you know what is the agreement that the President Duterte is referring to here? Because he said that we must honor our agreement with China. And what is that agreement? We have only one agreement with China on recto bank, and that is the Memorandum of Understanding on joint cooperation in the West Philippine Sea to extract oil and gas. That was signed. And I supported that because under that MOU, China will come in under our service contract system. Under our service contract system, the first whereas clause of every service contract says, whereas the Philippines owns the oil and gas covered by this service contract. And another provision says, whereas this contract will be governed by Philippine law. Two very important provisions are in the service contract. That's why I said, let China come in under those terms. And China signed. And the terms of reference, that document was also signed. So we have two documents, the MOU and the implementing terms of reference. There was supposed to be a third agreement, the commercial agreement between China National Offshore Oil Company and Forum Energy, the holder of the service contract in Reed Bank, over Reed Bank, that's service contract 72. They were supposed to agree how to implement the service contract. But at the last minute, China backed off. They refused to sign. They said, we will sign only if the Philippines will agree to remove that provision in the service contract that Philippine law governs the contract, and also to remove that provision that we own the oil and gas. Of course, we will not do that. That will overturn the arbitral award. And that is why the third agreement was never signed. And that's why it's in limbo. And that's why our Department of Foreign Affairs said, well, let the next administration look into that. So that agreement is in limbo because China wants to change the terms of the agreement. Not that we are withdrawing. It's China that's refusing to proceed with the third agreement. If China today agrees to service that service contract 72, to be the service contractor of Forum Energy or to buy into Forum Energy, well and good. We'll accept that, but they want to change the terms, and we cannot do that. If we remove that provision that Philippine law governs the contract, then what will they say? Chinese law governs the contract because Reed Bank is part of China's territory. We'll never allow that. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Tony. Another question from Mikey Andres and Maria Hartzog. Do you think that the UN has become obsolete in preventing conflicts among the superpowers? And according to Maria Hartzog, I read somewhere discussing the Minsk agreement in 1991 between Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. What happened to it? Professor De Castro, you might want to answer.
Yes, of course. Some scholars are saying the ink was not yet dry when they signed, of course, the San Francisco Conference creating the United Nations, when, of course, the UN automatically became obsolete. That started, of course, at the onset, yung sa crisis in Iran. Richard will know it about the Soviet occupation that portion of Iran. The Soviet,
Azerbaijan.
Iran was occupied by the Allied powers. The Soviets refused to evacuate, whereas the other Allied powers evacuated. Then that's already the beginning. There's already a division. And division was also reflected by the inability of the United Nations to form the military commission that kind of provided this, the capability for the UN to implement what we call the collective security system. It never happened. So even at the onset, and again, this has something to do with, a major concession asked by Joseph Stalin by Soviet Union, and that is, of course, the veto power. So that's the major limitation, of course, of the United Nations Security Council, the veto power, which of course had paralyzed the UN every time you have a major security issue that will involve one of the permanent members. And that's also the case with the South China Sea issue. We have a lot of pundits here, analysts are saying, why not bring the South China Sea issue into the United Nations Security Council? We will have China that will veto it. So even at the onset, that has been the case of the United Nations. So we have to look for other arrangement. The other arrangement, of course, eventually happened when you have the formation of, was it in 1979? 1949, I'm sorry, the Washington Treaty creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So it's an imperfect world. You cannot have a perfect solution. So the imperfect solution came out with the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which of course had maintained peace in Europe up to the time when the Cold War ended, and which of course also led to the NATO expansion in 1998. Not because NATO was aggressive, it's simply because former East European countries, former members of the Warsaw Pact, do not want to experience again Russian imperialism. So this accounted for the expansion of NATO up to the doorstep, of course, of at this point, no, unless of course Ukraine is occupied by Russian forces, then you will have again NATO countries having sharing a border with Russia. So that's the case. That is the unfortunate tragedy of the United Nations security system. What's the other question again?
It's about the Minsk agreement.
Oh, I will not. I think Justice Carpio will be in a better position, or Richard. Okay.
Let me just, I think I'll leave that to Justice Carpio and the Minsk agreement, because that's a very complicated issue also. But quickly on this, I mean, again, what is your alternative to UN? I mean, we had the situation when we didn't have UN at all. That's the 18th century, 19th century, 17th, 16th century. I mean, my goodness, tignan mo gaano kadami yung mga giyera ng mga panahon na yan. And as imperfect as UN is, it's actually at least a mitigating factor. It gives some room for weaker countries to air their grievances, to coordinate their pushback, and put some pressure on superpowers. That is why the Bush administration at least pretended to come up with some evidence that there was nuclear weapons with Saddam Hussein. That is why Russia is now feeling the heat, and there are all of these sanctions against Russia. In a world when you don't have UN, when you don't have multilateralism, what do you have? What you have is the rule of the jungle. And that's exactly what we don't have. We don't have a perfect world. We don't have a utopia. We have to strengthen the UN. Yes, it has limitations, but the alternative to a no UN world is way worse. And I think this is the problem we have. We forget about the world where we did not even have these imperfect organizations. I think the same argument applies to our legal warfare. They say, oh, yung UNCLOS ruling naman natin, di naman natin, we cannot shove it down the throat of China. Well, but if you didn't have that arbitration case at all, then we had even more limited leverage vis-a-vis China. So it's not about having a magic bullet. It's always about having mitigating elements to make sure that the worst instincts of imperialistic power, whether from the East or the West, is constrained. So UN is a constraining organization. It is not a containing organization that can contain the worst instincts of the imperialist powers, but it gives us some room for constrainment. That is why I think UN still has a lot of value. Not to mention, UN gives billions of dollars in developmental aid from Africa to Asia, all around the world. Wag din natin kalimutan, UN is not only about the question of war and peace, it's also about development.
Okay, thank you, Professor Heydarian. I will read now the last question addressed to Justice Carpio by Grace Pizarra. Justice Tony, after the term of President Duterte, can he be charged criminally for violating his oath of office as president based on his pronouncements that he could not or would not defend the West Philippine Sea despite the legal victory at The Hague?
Well, there is no specific law, criminal law, I mean, that we can invoke. Under the Constitution now, the recourse should be impeachment, because that is a violation of that's culpable violation of the Constitution, and that is also betrayal of public trust. But if he leaves office, there's nothing he cannot be impeached because he's out of office already. I do not see a particular provision in the penal code that has been violated, because treason is a crime during wartime. And of course, it's not wartime now. Thank you.
Just a follow-up question po, can President Duterte, can he be still held liable for his war against drugs, even if he's already out of office? Thank you.
Yes, because that's a crime. I mean, a lot of people were killed. Those killings could be murder, homicide, and if he can be linked to this killing, or if he gave instructions, or he paid the rewards out of his funds for these killings, then he can be held liable. But that's a specific crime under the revised penal code. Thank you.
Okay, at dyan po natin isinasara ang ating open forum. Ngayon po ay muli magsasalita sina Professor De Castro, Professor Heydarian, at Justice Carpio para sa kanilang mga closing statements. We will begin with Professor De Castro, to be followed by Professor Heydarian, then Justice Carpio. Thank you.
I'll just focus on the last slide ko, no, regarding this contagion, the strategic contagion. The war will not stay in Ukraine. The war will not stay in Europe. It would spread to our part of the world. So we need a leadership that has, of course, this sense of moral courage that could enable us to navigate to what I will call a very stormy period in international relations. We need a leader that also would be conscious of the need to fight for what we own, our rights. And of course, doesn't have any baggage. And of course, obviously doesn't use any substance. I'm not referring to anyone. So we need that kind of leadership. And I think I can only think of one person who will be able to lead us in what I will call this stormy period of international relations. And that's no other than, of course, Vice President Leni Robredo.
Thank you very much, Professor De Castro. Professor Heydarian?
I'm contractually obliged not to be partisan, so I'm not going to endorse anyone openly, but I think anyone can guess what I am for and against. And accordingly, you can see where I stand in terms of elections. I mean, for me, I think we are realizing that we are entering a completely new era. You can call it whatever you want, post-Cold War, new, the jungle grows back, whatever. The point is this: we cannot afford amateur hour. And we saw over the past few years that amateur hour has costs. And I'm so disgusted with all of these alternative experts saying that, oh, this is all sign of genius, and citing Sanju and Art of War to kind of justify and rationalize so many amateur hour performance by the guy in the Malacanang right now. Guess what? We kind of survived the worst in the past few years. But for the next president, please lang, get someone who has sense of dignity, basic sense of patriotism, at medyo naintindihan niya at gets niya yung mundo, and someone who's not, controversial abroad in the wrong way, or someone who's not facing court cases in some major countries around the world. So please lang, No more amateur hour. Someone who has the basic skills and capabilities. And also, look at the possible team. Because it's not only the president, but the team that the president brings in the table. Kaya ako tinitignan ko rin yung mga advisors at yung mga paligid, yung mga nakakapaligid dun sa mga ating mga kandidato. At base doon, nang magdidesisyon tayo sinong pinakamaganda at pinaka-deserving para maging ating sunod na Pangulo.
Thank you very much, Professor Hedaria. Now we go to Justice Carpio.
Thank you, JP. Just one last thought. We won in the Hague arbitration because the rule under the present United Nations Charter is right is might. Russia, in invading Ukraine, wants to change the rule. Might is right. And if Russia succeeds, China will follow in the West Philippine Sea. China will say might is right. And we can never win against that kind of rule because we are not a nuclear power. Militarily, we have a weak military as against China. We have to uphold the present rule. Right is might. And every candidate must say right is might, and that should not change. Russia should not be allowed to change the rule that right is might. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Tody. At dyan po, nagtatapos ang isa na namang tapatan, isang bayan. Paalala po, mayroon po tayong isa na namang tapatan bukas tungkol sa ating mga uniform personnel ng Armed Forces. Kaya magkikita-kita po tayo muli bukas. Sa muli, maraming salamat po. Ito po si Attorney JP Calleja na bumabati ng isang mapagpalayang araw sa inyong lahat. Maraming salamat po.
Kailangan nating palayain ang sarili mula sa kasalukuyang sitwasyon. Lalaban ako. Lalaban tayo.
Puno ng takot at kaba, kailan matatapos ating pagluha? Marami ang nawalan ng trabaho't mahal sa buhay. Isang malungkot na balita, ngunit hindi tayo mayayanig. Isang bayan at Lenny tutulong, basta't sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan. Ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno, nasan ka man, Leni Robredo tayo. Marami na ang gumaling, salamat sa mga bayaning tumulong. Walang takot lumalaban, alay ang buhay sa pagsagip. Isang magandang balita, hinding-hindi tayo papayanig. Isang bayan at Leni tutulong, basta't sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan. Ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno, nasan ka man, Leni Robredo tayo. Paghahandaan natin kahit ano pang dumating, tayo'y isang bansang matibay na kahit banggain. sabay, walang mang-iiwan. Ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno. Nasaan ka man, Leni Robredo tayo. Sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan. Ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno. Nasaan ka man, Leni Robredo tayo. Sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan. Ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno. Nasaan ka man, Leni Robredo tayo. Tapat na pinuno. Tapat na Pilipino. Leni Robredo tayo.